This show is sponsored by levities.co, raw, edgy, humorless apparel. You don't have to agree with us. Remember, you have that right. Thank you. Welcome to Mind Matters, and thank you for joining Dan Ploger and myself, John Krotek. This podcast is where we discuss the critical social, economic, and spiritual issues that affect all of us. We, the people, are in a battle against the forces of entropy, forces that are hell-bent on gaining power for personal reasons, forces hell-bent on destroying the concepts of freedom and individual thought, forces which don't benefit the social order. Thank you again. Good morning, Dan. How you doing, buddy?
Good morning, John. Good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. We're going to change it up a bit today on this episode of Mind Matters. We're going to talk about forgiveness. It's a subject of importance as well as all the other things we've talked about. No doubt, everywhere you look, we're living in an angsty environment, put it lightly. Disrespect is rampant. Hateful rhetoric is everywhere. And I think this has its roots in forgiveness.
Yeah, I think so. There's very close connections with when you talk and evaluate what is forgiveness. It has a big impact on today's culture and what's going on in the new progressive, postmodern, progressive, tyrannical attempts.
Psychologists generally define forgiveness as a conscious, deliberate decision to release feelings of resentment or vengeance toward a person or a group who has harmed you, regardless of whether they actually deserve your forgiveness. And I also read that part of, understanding forgiveness is also knowing what forgiveness is not. And experts who study this subject or teach forgiveness make it very clear that when you forgive somebody, you do not gloss over or deny the seriousness of the offenses that were perpetrated against you. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, nor does it mean condoning or excusing these offenses. So that being said, let's dig a little bit further. You mentioned this progressive, tyrannical situation, cancel culture we find ourselves in. Why in the world is there so much anger out there and people's unwillingness to forgive? Why?
Well, I think what I did in thinking about this subject is that in my engineering way, I pictured two bubbles, if you will. There's two people involved in this, or two groups. One is you, if you can imagine, you on the left side, and somebody else on the right side. And that person on the right side has offended you in some way, whether it's real, whether he really did something that caused you injury, or if you might just think that person caused you injury. So for under you have a sense of being victimized, and the offender is beyond your control. So you have two choices. You can either forgive or you cannot forgive. If you forgive, first of all, you need to define and recognize the seriousness, what the issue is, why you feel offended. secondly, you have to recognize I have no control over the behavior of the other person. So what I'm feeling is within myself. And is to forgive is to say that I will no longer be bothered by thoughts. I will no longer allow these thoughts of victimization to bother me. If you decide not to forgive, then you come into a victimization spiral, if you will, where your next step is you feel sorry for yourself and you pout, and your next step is to seek out other examples of where you have been victimized. And this becomes a downward spiral. It's a very, very bad emotional reaction. And in fact, serious victimhood, is a mental condition. And forgiveness is the antidote for victimhood. And that forgiveness only has to do with you, the one who's offended. It has nothing to do with the other party. That's an important thing. You are forgiving not for the benefit of the other guy that he may sleep at night or what have you. You can forgive without even informing the other person. But what you feel is a relief, and it's for your emotional benefit to forgive, and has nothing to do with the other party, with the offender.
Let's talk about thoughts and beliefs, and offensive thoughts and beliefs that may be so to us. And you mentioned forgiveness as really an antidote for ourselves, an antidote for resentment, an antidote for victimization. And that's what I think we're seeing a lot of. All this angst and all this hateful rhetoric and all this disrespect and all this major intolerance is really a result of a feeling of inferiority or a feeling of victimization. And for some reason, we've been brought up, or many people have been brought up, to think that forgiveness may be a sign of weakness, or, like you put it, it really is a reflection of ourselves, of that particular individual.
Right.
If people's beliefs and rhetoric and thoughts bother us and we find them offensive in our hearts or somewhere, wherever, we need to forgive them, maybe, or forgive ourselves for how they make us feel. Because if we forgive ourselves first, then it makes it easier to forgive them. Maybe we say this in the quietness of our minds, but I'm feeling really offended by that. And rather than attack this person, I'm going to forgive myself for feeling offended, which is going to make it easier to forgive them, or to at least accept, not really accept in theory, but accept the situation. You know, I saw last night, of course, it always comes back to something that's in a real world time. But AOC, Alexandria Cortez,
Sandy, we call her. Her
yeah,
friends Sandy.
she was in a talk with her constituents yesterday, and they were going off on her about the things she hasn't done and about crime in her jurisdiction. And she made fun of it. She was dancing and acting kind of ridiculous. And she seemed like she was just inflaming the situation and creating something that. So I looked at her and I looked at the clip, and I just forgave her for being so ridiculous. I couldn't believe that was a congresswoman. Rather than get all upset and send a post here or a post there and feel like somehow I was offended by that, I just forgave her for being so ridiculous.
Good point, and a healthy attitude. And understand, when somebody like that offends you, they are putting on you an emotional burden that you must bear. That's an unpleasant emotional burden. And you can desire to carry that burden that they put upon you, or you can shed it and say, it really has no effect on me. I forgive you. You didn't, by the way, have to send her an email or a TikTok video telling her you forgive her. Just the fact that you forgive her is good for John. It's not good for Sandy Cortez.
And that's that anger. When we see these people doing the things that we wouldn't personally do, or you maybe somebody in their position, we think that maybe there needs to be a better attitude or a better display of behavior. What harm has she really done when these people do things? What harm have they really done? And what we need to do is acknowledge whether or not we've been harmed, and we need to somehow worry about our own behavior before we release all that anger and hate and intolerance. Forgiveness is almost like a personal commitment to a process of change and to move on from your victimization suffering to something different, recognizing the value of yourself and that you don't have to feel like a victim. And if you are offended, you don't have to behave in a way that becomes just as offensive back to them.
Well, we live in a society now in the United States where victimhood is a badge of honor. If you listen to MSNBC and the black commentators, the racist black commentators, it's unbelievable how they are preying upon, I guess, guilt. I guess victimhood, the response of victimhood is to inflict guilt on your offender. That's another option. Rather than forgiveness, you have two choices. I can inflict guilt, or I can forgive. And inflict guilt means further communication with the offending party. And to forgive means I don't need to involve the other party at all. I can forgive Sandy Cortez just because I view her as a late blooming adolescent. She still has some years to go just to really be what I would consider a legitimate adult human being. But so I guess I can deny that I was offended if I was offended or injured. But I don't think that's a healthy emotional response either. So I guess we can inflict guilt, we can forgive, we can inflict guilt, or we can just not forgive and just move on and carry the burden, the emotional burden that we either decide to elect to accept or not.
The things that you just said point out the fact that it's different for everybody. People's feelings and the way they behave, the way I do may not be the way you do. How you deal with victimization or being offended. When we feel victimized or offended, I think it's important to stay focused and to try to de-escalate emotionally what's going on than to try to lower ourselves and become an unforgiving, uncompassionate, disempathetic or unempathetic person, and realize that whatever those feelings are, they're not the feelings of the offender or the perpetrator. They're your feelings.
Yes, exactly. That's what's in your head. And it's not something you can throw in the trash. It's not something you can burn up. It's something that you have to do in your own mind to correct. And like we said, you have several options at that point. The ideal in my mind is a healthy mind is not a mind that feels victimized. I'm no psychologist, but I'm sure that in my mind, in Dan's view, victimhood is a mental disease. Also, in this whole discussion, we see a theater of the absurd. For instance, Meghan Markle, who makes a career out of being victimized. Al Sharpton, who makes a career out of catering to the victimized or perceived victims. This is an industry in itself. And we just have to recognize it's a force for evil. It's a force for not, let's not say that. It's a force for bad. And why do we encourage bad forces? They should be eliminated for us to be healthy and for us to have healthy discourse with others.
It's an interesting point, and it's true, because when we remain silent, we don't expose, we don't challenge the things that we see, like victimhood or the business of victimhood, then we become complicit. And it's easier said than done. Forgiveness is a challenge for everybody, because when you feel offended, you just want to let them have it. You want to make them feel guilty, or make them feel just as bad as you do, and then you become the equal part of that reaction. I think there's a scientific, for every reaction there's an equal and opposite reaction, but it's the opposing forces are equal.
Yeah. Newton's first law. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, gosh, you raise the interesting topic of the business of victimhood. And you're right, people have made an entire life out of that, and it does nothing for the social construct. It does nothing for populations and societies and organizations. Imagine what a world would be like without victims. You probably wouldn't even need forgiveness, because there would be so much positivity out there. But as we all know, the second law of thermodynamics, that entropy, the negative forces of any system, are constantly there, constantly tugging and pulling at us. And so I would say forgiveness is anti-entropic and part of the human organism that creates a better environment, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think so. Exactly. By reducing bad emotions. I mean, one of the responses, I guess, to being a victim is revenge, strike back. But what does that accomplish? That accomplishes nothing other than the destruction of something good in the offender, in your offender. So obviously that's not a healthy response. So forgiveness is the shedding of emotional entropy that has been inflicted upon you. I guess
no, that's absolutely what it is. And I would support that with saying that forgiveness is a choice. We all choose to forgive. And I think that we can begin to move in that direction of forgiveness when we move away from that role of being a victim. I think that's step number one, is to move away from that role and to practice some compassion. I'm not saying going full tilt boogie with empathy, but keep empathy in mind. And then, like anything in life, even a good wine, takes time. There's a process. You might not get it right, but understand that this forgiveness practice or behavior is a process.
Yeah.
And you may not get it right the first time or the second time or the third time or whatever, how many times it takes, especially if you're a knucklehead like me. It might take you a whole lifetime to forgive people. But just to understand that there are going to be times when you act human and you might lash out or find it impossible to forgive somebody for what they've done to you.
What does the healthy mind do when other people claim to be victims and demand that you feel guilty about not responding to their shortcomings or shortfalls?
My wife had an analogy or a metaphor But we heard misery loves company. So these people who are offending or creating victims, they obviously are feeling maybe a victim themselves. But also, my wife said this, that it's almost like people have a ball of crap rolled up in their pocket, and they go around and they live their lives offending people, creating people with thoughts of victimhood, and they can't wait to find the next person who's going to take that ball of crap and stick it in their own pocket, kind of like the dung beetle,
Carry it on.
but
Spread,
that's
pay it forward.
yeah, and you can do that with crap too. So
Yeah.
when you can finally realize that you don't have to take that. I'm sorry that you feel that way, but I'm not. I'm going to reject what you say. And
Or
guess what? And I'm entitled to reject that because I have just as much of a right of being here and having my own beliefs as you do.
well, there's another too, is what when people claim to be victims, you as a normal, rational human being, what is your, what is your response? But you could say it's heartless to not acknowledge that. But I don't believe that a lot of people that claim to be victims are really victims, number one. So it's a lie in a sense. I don't believe that Black Americans are as downtrodden as they claim to be in the United States. I think that the United States has done a very good job of overcoming past harms, but allowing equal opportunity. And you see examples of African Americans who have made great successes of themselves. Ben Carson, a neurosurgeon, how about that? So I don't feel, or I don't honor the claim of victimhood. Therefore, I'm not going to allow it. I'm not going to accept guilt. And I'm going to, when people claim victimhoods, I will look at each case and decide whether they're being truthful, whether they have a good case to put forward, and then I will decide whether there's something that I should do as a good human being, as with the intent of the biblical philosophy of helping the downtrodden. I prefer, and I do a lot of that, and you do a lot of that when you pay taxes. A lot of that money is distributed to the less fortunate, as they're called. And I would rather I have that choice to decide where my money goes. But we live in a system where a bunch of politicians make those decisions. So there's also the element, I just summarize this little anecdote, I guess, is that there's also an element of the worthiness of the claim of victimhood. And I reject it entirely. I reject that I have anything to do with slavery in the United States of America. I don't. My grandparents were immigrants, and that was long after the slavery period. So, I have nothing to do with that. Another is to recognize when the claim of victimhood is really intended to put guilt upon you, and that's just evil. That's just bad behavior. That's just bullying, if you will. It's emotional bullying, and I reject that. So I'm very careful when people claim to be victims. Meghan Markle is not a victim of anything. She was hired on one of the game shows, and she complained the other day about how they really weren't interested in her mind. They were only interested in her body. And the fact is, whoever hired her said, I'm more interested in beauty. I don't care about brains. I want somebody who looks stunning. So, Megan, what are you doing there if you didn't want to be an object of beauty? Nobody was interested in your brains. Nobody wanted them. They didn't hire you for that, Megan. And all of these people in high positions that claim victimhood is just it's become a fashionable illness. Let's call it that. And again, I just say again that forgiveness is the antidote for victimhood. It'll keep you out of being a victim.
Absolutely, Dan. Couldn't agree with you more. Forgiveness is a choice, but so is victimhood. It's a choice. It's a state of mind. And perhaps if you live in the victimhood mentality or state of mind, then it creates this lack of forgiveness. I look at like what Reagan said, what trust but verify. I like forgive and don't forget. Remember how we were like led to believe forgive and forget. And therein lies half the problem. You're kicking that can down the road all the time because but you can't forget.
Isn't it funny?
Well, it is. Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with not forgetting, forgiving and not forget. These are things that we were told when we were children. These are wise things. Those are wise sayings. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. Where the hell did that go?
Yeah, and the golden
wise
rule
advice
that you mentioned before. So we might ask, how do we reach the state of forgiveness? And I think number one is to recognize the value of it and how it can really help the situation, how it can not only improve your life, but the situation that's surrounding the imposed victimhood or the idea. And then I think you said it at the outset, is that forgiveness really is about the person who's forgiving. Think about why you're forgiving and why you need to forgive and move on. Not forget, but move on. And, once you acknowledge your emotions, and if you can start to look at things from 50,000 feet instead of very narrow, you can start to see the positive effect that each of us can have as individuals, whether it's in a family or a business or an organization or in our communities and in the global population. If we can get out of victimhood mentality and start practicing some real authentic forgiveness, each human being has an opportunity to find amazing peace of mind, but also I think it would lead to amazing personal successes.
Good, healthy mind, a good inquiring mind is healthy, and you create an aura. If you ever see somebody pouting, that's being a victim. They perceive themselves as having been a victim. There's just a black cloud over their head. You don't want to be around. I don't like to be around people who are pouting. I mean, sometimes they've got good reason for it, and maybe Dr. Phil would be attracted to something like that, but I try to avoid pouters, and because I prefer to be around positive people, positive vibes, positive auras, positive things that look for opportunity and not for damage.
No, good point. And I think about my dog and how I might scream and yell at my dog and she might feel offended, right? But you don't see her pouting because 5 minutes later her tail's wagging and she's right back on my lap.
Right.
So, why don't we take why can't we learn some lessons from the animals around us? And
that's a good observation.
Think about that. Yeah, thanks. So there you have it. Forgiveness is a choice. You choose to forgive. I'm not saying to forget. We're not saying that. But if we could start the road to our own recovery, is what I would call it, the forgiveness recovery process, maybe we can really change and diffuse this global environment of angst.
I think you nailed it right on the head, John.
It's worth a shot. Talk to you soon, Dan.
Okay, John. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Mind Matters. Use your critical thinking. Use logic and reason. Make your own determinations on the critical issues. Stay alert, stay alive.